Alright, this is Unit 2, Video 4, and then we're going to look at the second part of the American Revolution in this video. First up, we'll look at Valley Forge. During the winter of 1777 and 1778, George Washington and his troops camped outside of Philadelphia at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. As you can imagine, camping outside in the winter in Pennsylvania is not a ideal situation, and so the conditions were terrible. It was cold, the soldiers had very little supplies, some didn't have shoes, some didn't have winter jackets. It was pretty miserable. The success, though, at Valley Forge came from the training that they received while in camp there, and we're going to look at a couple of people who were influential in that training, but the ability of the troops to come out of Valley Forge stronger is a real win for the colonists. One of the guys that helps train the troops, probably the most influential, is a Prussian named Baron von Steuben. He assisted Washington in training the troops in kind of close drill tactics, so bayonets and that sort of thing at Valley Forge. Another person who helped Washington at Valley Forge was a Frenchman, an aristocrat named the Marquis de Lafayette. So Lafayette was very influential in helping the French and American alliance. We talked about Franklin and Jefferson doing that from the American standpoint. On the French side, it's Lafayette who is trying to convince the French, specifically the king, to assist the colonists in this revolution. He believed deeply in the American cause, and he worked alongside Washington in making the army into a professional one, making sure that they had some of the supplies and things that they needed. As I mentioned, Lafayette was also a very critical link in this Franco-American alliance and worked to get a lot of these supplies from France. One of those things was gunpowder. They lacked that very badly. With leadership skills and the assistance of foreign aid, Washington was able to essentially turn Valley Forge into what today we think of as a boot camp, and it was very successful as a result. The Continental Army emerged as a skilled, trained, and professional army. They lost about a third of their men, either to starvation or to the elements, or some of them just quit and went home. But the two-thirds that remained, the two-thirds that came out of Valley Forge, were much better trained and a much more formidable army. Picture on the left, Washington at Valley Forge, and here on the right you have some reenactors, so it gives you kind of an idea of what it would have looked like in an actual photograph during 1777 and 78. This guy on the left here is Baron von Steuben, the Prussian military genius that we talked about, and then the guy on the right is the Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman, and he kind of looks like a French aristocrat in that picture. That's a pretty good portrait of him. So a couple of questions here. What role did the Marquis de Lafayette play in the Revolutionary War? And then also, what role did Baron von Steuben play in the war? They're both going to help the troops at Valley Forge, but Lafayette is going to play more of a role of a diplomat in helping the French decide to join in on the colonist cause. Whereas Baron von Steuben is going to play a much more significant role specifically at Valley Forge in training troops, in actual battle tactics and that sort of thing. So Lafayette's more of the diplomatic side, and von Steuben is more of the actual practical military tactics. A couple more questions here on Valley Forge. Washington created a professional military called the Continental Army. And then your question asks, why would a professional military be important during the Revolutionary War? The colonists are fighting the best, most well-supplied, most well-trained army on the planet in the British Army. And so having a group of soldiers that could actually line up and trade volleys with the British was very important. It was something they were lacking beforehand. And so this gave them the ability to actually line up with the British Redcoats. And then the question at the bottom asks what occurred at Valley Forge in the winter of 77 and into 78 as well. So you have Washington and his troops being camped there. It's their winter camp. But the importance there is that they emerge as this professional military, that they have been training all winter, and that they come out of this as an actual trained group of soldiers. Let's look at three different groups of people during the war. We're going to start with women. Women helped the war effort usually by traveling alongside the armies. They served as nurses, as cooks, some even served as spies. And it's pretty unlikely that any women actually fought in these battles, but there are stories of women who disguised themselves as men and tried to enlist in the army to actually fight alongside of men. Picture on the left is kind of a romanticized picture of this woman. She's loading this cannon powder into, or the gunpowder into this cannon here. And then this picture on the right is a picture of Nancy Hart, where she came in with these soldiers in her home. And Hart County in Georgia is named for Nancy Hart, and the only county in the state of Georgia that's named for a woman. And so that's a legacy of the Revolution as well. Let's look at Native Americans now and their role in the war. They largely fought on the side of the British during the war. If you remember back to the proclamation line of 1763, this really makes sense because the British were trying to limit the colonists being able to travel west of the Appalachians. So the Native Americans saw that as the British were actually trying to, have some sort of peace with them. Whereas the colonists, they believed, wanted to expand to the Mississippi, and they were right in that. And this was due, mainly to that proclamation line, but the natives believed that the British were actually trying to better relations with them, and so they're going to largely pick the British side. Some tribes did fight for the Patriot cause, however, and the issue split a lot of tribes between Loyalists and Patriot allies, so some tribes were split over the decision of who to help in the actual revolution. It's just a picture here with Native Americans and the British. Remember that largely they're going to side with the British in this war. Then also we'll take a look at blacks during the war, both free and slave. Since the Declaration of Independence was a call for recognition of natural rights, as we talked about with John Locke, many blacks believed that the Revolution would give them a better standing in society. That this revolution, that the Declaration is written kind of as a way they saw it to gain a better standing in society, a way for them to climb the social ladder. At the Boston Massacre, which is not a standard, but there's a black man killed in that. Of the 5 killed, one of those is named Crispus Attucks, and he supported the Patriots' challenge of British authority, obviously, if he's at the Boston Massacre. And it's believed that about 5,000 blacks fought on the side of the Patriots. Many more fought also on the side of the Loyalists as well during the Revolution. And the picture on the left is the Boston Massacre, and this is Crispus Attucks. And then here you see a picture of some British redcoats and a black soldier there firing as well. So 3 questions here. What role did women play in the war? It was often spies or nurses or cooks when they traveled along with these armies. The next question asks, what role did Native Americans play? So they're gonna fight in this war, actual soldiers in this war, and they're gonna fight on both sides. You'll see some on the Patriots and on the Loyalists. The large majority are going to fight on the Loyalist side. And then finally, what role did blacks play in the war? They're also going to serve a role as soldiers. Not equal pay, none of those things. Even when we get to the Civil War and we talk about the Union soldiers, black and white soldiers in the Union Army, they weren't paid the same either. So there's going to be discrepancies there. But black soldiers did fight in the Revolution, and they did some fight on both sides. So